of a person who had a ringside seat at many important global events and indeed a role in those events. I find myself appreciating the circumstances in which she passed. She had good care. She had good medical supervision. She was in secure shelter in a place that she loved. And I am glad for that. I do wonder whether, given the state that Britain is in today, which is in a state of crisis preceding her passing, whether many British pensioners will have the same easeful passing this winter. I fear not. I think many people will be in insecure housing, without heat, potentially without food, and certainly without immediate access to good medical care. So I'm really struck by the distinction or the difference between the circumstances of Queen Elizabeth's passing and what many of her subjects may have to endure this coming winter in a country where, the monarchy really has come to represent the deep and profound and grave inequality and gap that it is going to be a problem in the months to come.
Ash Sarkar, you're on the ground there in London. You're a journalist, a contributing editor at Novara Media. What is your response to the death and the legacy of Queen Elizabeth?
Well, I suppose my personal response is one of curiosity, interest. There are very few moments that could be described as truly historic, but the death of Britain's longest reigning monarch is, of course, definitely historic. It's one of the series of historical events in the UK. Kings and queens, rather than other things that might become politically. So I think very central to our national self-image. I think one thing to explain for American viewers is just how top-down and choreographed the National Parliament is. Died in 1997, it was very much a bottom-up outpouring of grief. You had people spontaneously laying flowers outside Buckingham Palace, and in fact the palace was very surprised by the emotional response which was offered up by the country. When the Queen dies, it is a different thing. The BBC immediately changes its programming, so there will be no comedies being scheduled between now and the funeral. Even the music on the radio changes to more somber playlists. Television presenters are all dressed in black, and even though this isn't something which is directed by either the government or royal protocol, public events like football matches are being suspended. Now, one of the really critical things is that parliamentary business is also suspended. One of the things that Priya mentioned is that we are, of course, in the middle of this dreadful cost of living crisis. One of the main causes behind that is that energy bills are out of control. Now, Parliament will be suspended perhaps for 7 days, perhaps for 10. And depending on how those days are calculated, whether it's like business days or whether it's like calendar days, that could mean that the opportunity to pass the legislation needed to control energy prices, that window of opportunity closes. Now, the government will be negotiating with the palace in order to try and make the time to pass that legislation, but I think very few people would consider it an ideal political system where an elected government effectively has to haggle with the institution of the royal family, the institution of the palaces, in order to get vital governmental business done.
And Professor Maya Jasanoff, you wrote this piece in the New York Times, the headline being, "More in the Queen, Not Her Empire." Talk about the Queen and the Empire.
The Queen was born into a world that looked radically different in certain ways from the one that she departed yesterday. She, was born in 1926 at a time when something on the order of 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 people in the world was a subject of her family. And it's an astonishing extent of global power. When she became queen in 1952, the Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. The leaders of the USSR, China, and the US were respectively Stalin, Mao, and Truman. These were figures who were, of course, associated now in our minds with a vanished era, and the Queen herself long outlived them. And I think one of the consequences of that is that the empire, which largely disintegrated under the course of her tenure on the throne, had this kind of public face in the form of the Queen that actually survived well into the 21st century. So, I find myself reflecting on this occasion that, of course, some of the things that Priya pointed out, the longevity of a person who, by virtue of a uniquely privileged birth, had a ringside seat to all of these amazing events, and also had a remarkable passage into her later life. But, normally the death of a 96-year-old woman wouldn't account for, any headlines whatsoever. And the fact that she was still sort of with us into this radically new world, I find, really a sort of a moment for reflection on what kind of visions people have for a global order, and I think this is a really important moment for trying to think through what new visions might look like in a period, obviously, of both national crisis for the UK and in many ways global crisis with, of course, climate change and the rise of authoritarianism.
And on that issue of, many commentators, and it's not only British media that is only covering this, the U.S. media, especially the cable channels, are almost exclusively covering just the Queen's death. But if you can talk about Queen Elizabeth, when it comes to one of their comments of the commentators, she was deeply knowledgeable about foreign policy, which goes to the issue of the British Empire, and what we should understand about the 20th century. We'll start with Professor Jasanoff, then to Priya Gopal.
Sure. So the Queen, in her role as monarch, she was never an empress in name. That title had been stripped from the British monarchy with the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947. But she did preside over the consolidation and massive expansion of the Commonwealth, into which most of the former British colonies were assimilated, became members. And her role as head of the Commonwealth was manifestly something that she took incredibly seriously. Now, she presumably undertook this almost in part out of the idea that she was sustaining certain sorts of values that members of her class are long associated with their imperial rule, for example, defense of constitutionalism and the rule of law, human rights, and so on. She also personally clearly was involved in agitating to the extent that any monarch does in an extremely limited span that they allow themselves against apartheid and so on. But, it's also really important to note that the Commonwealth was a vehicle designed to be a vehicle for the perpetuation of British global influence, even when the colonies chose to break away from that. So, to the extent that the Queen kind of leans into that, she was part and parcel of a perpetuation of myths of imperial benevolence that carried on deep into the 20th century. Another quick point I would make is that the Queen had these weekly meetings, more or less, with all of her prime ministers, and many of the prime ministers have commented on, as you say, how knowledgeable she was and what good advice she gave, and so on. But it's interesting that this is a part of the government business of the UK that is not on the record at all. And although the power of the monarchy in all sorts of ways is really rather negligible in terms of their explicit ability to dictate policy and so on, the fact that every single week the Prime Minister has an audience with the Queen that is not monitored or documented or anything of the kind is quite a remarkable black box, I think, at the center of the British state.
Professor Priya Gopal, you wrote the book Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Descent. We usually speak to you at the University of Cambridge. Can you elaborate more on the British Empire, looking at Africa, looking at India, looking at, and in a moment we're going to go directly to the Caribbean, to Barbados.
Yeah, I mean, I slightly wonder if we in fact live in a deeply different world from the one that she came into in 1952. Let us remember that when she became queen at Treetops in Kenya, Britain had just commenced a brutal, vicious insurgency that carried on for several years. In recent years, we have had Kenyans who were tortured by the British raise lawsuits successfully in some cases about around the vicious violence of the British state at that point. On the matter of whether, and I do wonder whether we actually live in a deeply different world. We live in a world where formally the British crown is no longer an imperial crown. But let us remember that Elizabeth II was, in a sense, obsessed with the Commonwealth, made sure that Charles III would also be head of the Commonwealth. And we have to probe this cozy notion that somehow empire ended beautifully, and then there was this happy nation of families that was the Commonwealth, and she sat at the top of the table, and now Charles III will sit at the top of that table. I think, as Maya just suggested, much of that order has not changed. But the other thing I want to say is that we often talk about monarchy as an anachronism. So, she came into a world where monarchy was normal, and now it's an anachronism. Actually, we still have a world order in which both in Britain and in the colonies, there is enormous concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. And monarchy really, in a sense, is not anachronistic. It represents exactly what we are ruled by across the world, in the US as much as anywhere else. Power and privilege and wealth in the hands of a few, which the rest of us are then invited to worship and think of as perfectly normal. The monarchy is really one aspect of plutocracy, ruled by the wealthy. And that is something that hasn't essentially changed from 1952 to 2022. If anything, here we are again, ruled by a handful of oligarchs across the world, as ordinary people in Britain and beyond suffer deprivation. So I slightly wonder if we do in fact live in a very different world from the one that she inherited. And in terms of the knowledge of foreign policy, I think what it is that she was very faithful and dutiful, as the word is often used in the British press, about representing the British state's understanding of its own foreign policy. I have no evidence that she was knowledgeable about what was happening in the colonies, that she was knowledgeable about the enormous violence with which empire ended in many places. When she came to power, there were, brutal counterinsurgencies, not just in Kenya, but in Malaya and Cyprus. Many of the records of the crimes of the British state at that point have been destroyed willfully by the British state. So, how much did she know? We won't know that, but did she speak on these matters? Could she speak on these matters? Was she knowledgeable about what took place? I'm afraid I have no evidence of anything other than that she and the institution of the monarchy perpetuates the British states and the British elites' narrative of itself and of Britain.
Well, in November, Barbados officially removed Queen Elizabeth II as its head of state, freeing itself from the British monarchy after nearly 400 years of colonization. Prince Charles joined the ceremony, where he formally acknowledged Britain's, quote, appalling atrocity of slavery in the Caribbean. Joining us now from Christchurch, Barbados, is Pedro Welch. He is a historian, a former chair of the Barbados Reparations Task Force. Professor Welch, you were in Britain when the Queen's death was announced. You just flew back to Barbados. Thank you so much for joining us on the phone. Can you respond to the Queen's death and what the monarchy has meant for Barbados?
Thank you very much. Most certainly, the passing of the Queen has some importance with respect to the very fragmented relationship between the various colonies in the Caribbean, and including Barbados and Britain. I'm saying this because when one looks at the history of the monarchy and the history of the slave trade, the British monarchy was embedded in the institutions that financed the beginnings of the slave trade from Britain. And through the centuries, the British monarchy continued to benefit from the colonial exploitation of the plantation colonies in the Caribbean. But having said that, we are into a very interesting period in which there are a number of things that tend to coincide. The first one is that monarchy is really not an anachronism when it comes to people of African descent, because there were monarchies in Africa. And in fact, the very first slave rebellion that was planned, that we know of, in Barbados, in that first slave rebellion, the enslaved people, in fact, planned to install a monarch in Barbados as king of Barbados. So the notion of a monarchy is not necessarily foreign to African sensibilities. And it is in that context that there's a tremendous lot of respect, if not necessarily agreement, but a lot of respect for an institution of monarchy, an institution that speaks of power. When one looks at the whole question of the persistence of a parliamentary system in the Caribbean and in Barbados, in which the monarch was the head of state, the Queen was the head of state, that reflects in part the very successful acculturation of the subject populations into aspects of a British culture, so that I think most Barbadians, most Caribbean people will view her passing certainly with the respect that one would give to any person of authority. But at the same time, there are some of us who understand the history of our people, who understand that the enslavement of our ancestors has led to a legacy of deprivation, a legacy that and other former colonial powers to acknowledge the tremendous harm that has been done. So that again, finally to the question, there will be respect. The respect that all the Africans really give to our patriarch or matriarch, and then that they're passing. But that respect does not necessarily mean that we have forgotten what that monarchy did in this institutional phase, what it did to our people in the past.
Ash Sarkar, I know you have to leave. We go back from Barbados to London. You're a journalist there. If you can talk about what's acceptable to talk about in this time of mourning, and I think the mourning that new King Charles III has announced will go something like 7 days beyond the funeral. Not clear when that will be. What is acceptable? And also, if you can talk about now King Charles III, Prince Charles.
In terms of what's considered acceptable by the media, it is very, very little. So in some ways, this is an opportunity to redraw the boundaries of legitimate opinion ever tighter. It's still technically against the law to call for the abolition of the monarchy on British media. It's not a law that's enforced, but I think that tells you something about the framing of these issues. I think that one of the problems that we found consistently in this country is that the monarchy has managed to adapt itself to a totally revolutionized media environment in a way which has consolidated a lot of their cultural power. Now, this wasn't always going to be a certain thing. During the 1990s, tabloid press intrusion in terms of the status of the marriages of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, of Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, and Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, you can see that really clearly is the suspension of the football matches this weekend. Now, as anyone knows about England, we are a football nation. This wasn't something which even happened after the death of George VI, the Queen's father. So this is something which is relatively new. I think that tells you something about that top-down mood of national mourning that I was just describing earlier. When it comes to Prince Charles, he is the oldest monarch we've had at the time of the ascension to the throne. I think that does pose some difficulties for the nation's self-image. The Queen coming to the throne as a young woman, the mother of a grown family, was something which was really integral to her public image. She was seen as a maternal and grandmotherly figure, and that was an image which was very carefully cultivated by her press advisors. Priya has been talking a lot about the nature of the Commonwealth and the way in which it re-embodies many of the imperialist dynamics. I think that this is an anecdote which kind of spells out the uneven distribution of power within the Commonwealth. The Queen's former private secretary, Martin Charteris, described the Queen descending upon the Commonwealth as being like nanny or mother, and that she could discipline her unruly children with a single look, no more of your bloody nonsense. And that maternal image was really central, I think, to the Queen steering the monarchy through a time of profound change, the end of formal empire at least, and also the media revolution. Prince Charles come to the throne as already an old man, as somebody whose private life has been splashed all over the front pages of British tabloids. It's a very different thing. It's, I think, in some ways been tarnished by some of these more intrusive press practices. And I wonder if what we'll see is a redoubling on monarchical fervour on the part of the press in order to make up for their former bad behaviour.
Now, Democracy Now! Isn't British media. Would you call, Ash, for the abolition of the monarchy?
I'm a Republican. I think that a modern
that has a different meaning in the United
should
States.
Be subject to democratic accountability. Pardon? Oh yeah, I understand that. So by a Republican, I mean that a monarch, constitutional or not, should not be the head of state. I think that we should have an elected president, because one of the problems with having the kind of uncodified constitution that we have here in the UK, whilst also having a so-called constitutional monarch, is that the exercise of power in some ways is very, very opaque. I can give you another example of this. The Privy Council, which is made up of British lords and MPs, ministers and former ministers, is still the highest court of appeal for many countries in the Commonwealth, countries which include British overseas territories of, shall we say, ambiguous status, like the British Virgin Islands, which are a notorious international tax haven. And that ambiguous legal status and the fact that the Privy Council is still the highest court of appeal means that in some ways the British Virgin Islands can operate as this kind of, dark twin sibling of the City of London. So if the City of London isn't good enough for you to hide your wealth from public authorities, then you can just stash it in the British Virgin Islands, and legal proceedings will hardly ever see the light of day, because the government of the British Virgin Islands and the Privy Council and the British government are always arguing about whose responsibility it actually is. So constitutional monarchy allows for that very opaque exercise of power, which I think is in itself politically toxic. But even if that wasn't the case, I think as a modern state, we should be looking towards an elected head of state rather than one who was placed there by this narrative of bloodline superiority.
Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. And an interesting fact, even as Harry and Meghan Markle left the royal family and charged the royal family with racism, their children will now become Prince and Princess Archie and Lisbeth Diana, who live in the United States, because Harry's father, Prince Charles, has now ascended to the throne, and they are his grandchildren. That's King Charles III. Ash Sarkar, thanks so much for being with us, contributing editor at Novara Media in London. Pedro Welch, historian and former chair of the Barbados Reparations Task Force, joining us from Barbados, just back from London. Harvard University professor Maya Jasanoff will link to your New York Times op-ed, Mourn the Queen, Not Her Empire. And University of Cambridge professor Priya Gopal, author of Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Dissent. As California faces a record-breaking heat wave, climate activists joined Indigenous and Appalachian groups at a rally in Washington, D.C. Thursday to protest against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. The protest came a month after President Biden signed the $739 billion Inflation Reduction Act, which included major concessions to West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, the biggest recipient of fossil fuel money in Congress. One provision expedites fossil fuel permitting, including for the controversial MVP, that's Mountain Valley Pipeline. If built, it'll carry 2 billion cubic feet of frack gas across more than 1,000 streams and wetlands in Appalachia, including parts of West Virginia. On Thursday, Senator Bernie Sanders, the independent of Vermont, slammed what he described as a disastrous side deal.
In the coming weeks and months, the Senate has a fundamental choice to make. We can listen to the fossil fuel industry and the politicians they pay, who are spending huge amounts of money on lobbying and campaign contributions to pass this dirty side deal. Or we can listen to the scientists and the environmental community, who are telling us loudly and clearly to reject this side deal and eliminate the $15 billion in tax breaks and subsidies Congress is already providing to big oil and gas companies each and every year. Mr. President, while the legislative text of the side deal has not been made public, according to a one-page summary that was released last month, this bill would make it easier for the fossil fuel industry to receive permits to complete some of the dirtiest and most polluting oil and gas projects in America. Specifically, this deal would approve the $6.6 billion Mountain Valley Pipeline, a 303-mile frack gas pipeline spanning from West Virginia to Virginia and potentially on to North Carolina. We're talking about a pipeline that would generate emissions equivalent to 37 coal plants or over 27 million cars each and every year. Mr. President, it is hard for me to understand why anyone who is concerned about climate change would consider for 1 second voting to approve a pipeline that would be equivalent to putting 27 million more cars on the road each and every year.
Senator Sanders spoke on the same day as protesters rallied in Washington, D.C. against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. We're joined now by two guests who took part in the protest. Russell Chisholm is the Mountain Valley